effective immediately. Malik Rivers is no longer part of Rivers Development Group.
Mr. Rivers, any comment on this? Fire every one of them.
Understood. I'm on it.
Nobody standing in that crowd, soaked in rain, knew the truth. This counterstrike had been moving in total silence for 14 months. In just 6 hours, the entire Steele family would learn exactly what they had just lost, and exactly who had been in control the whole time. My name is Malik Rivers. I'm 45 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed one simple thing. If you build something with your own 2 hands, nobody can ever really take it from you. I was wrong about the taking part. I was right about everything else. On a Tuesday morning in October, I stood on the granite steps of the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta, rain coming down soft and steady, holding a manila folder with my own divorce decree inside it. My wife stood 12 feet away, smiling for a camera crew that hadn't been invited by me. Her mother stood beside her, holding an umbrella like a queen holding a scepter. I noticed something small that morning, the kind of detail you file away without understanding why yet. Zora's knuckles were pale where she gripped that umbrella. Not the grip of a woman celebrating, but of someone holding on to something for dear life. Behind her performance for the cameras, I caught the flicker of real fear. I didn't know what to make of it then. I would, eventually. Here's the part that should tell you something isn't what it looks like. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shouting. I had my phone in my hand, and I was about to make a call to the one person who'd stood beside me since the beginning. Before we get into the story, I want you to sit with something. In 14 months, everything my wife's family built to take from me would cost them more than they ever imagined. And they wouldn't understand why until it was far too late. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the courthouse. Before that. It was 6:30 in the morning, the kind of soft, gray Atlanta morning where the fog sits low over Peachtree Street, and the coffee shops haven't turned their signs around yet. I'd been awake since 5, same as I had been for 22 years. Ever since I was 19 years old, hauling lumber on job sites before the sun came up, learning the difference between men who talked about building things and men who actually built them. My son Kai was still asleep down the hall, 12 years old, all elbows and quiet questions, the kind of kid who watches everything and says little. I stood in his doorway for a moment that morning, the way I did most mornings, just to hear him breathing steady. I didn't know yet that in 6 hours, a judge would sign a piece of paper ending my marriage, and that my own company, the one I built up from a 2-man framing crew into Rivers Development Group, a firm that had put up condos in Midtown and revitalized 3 blocks of Atlantic Station, would no longer have my name on the door. I want to tell you about the man I was before that morning, because it matters for what comes next. I don't raise my voice. I never have. My father used to say, a man who has to yell to be heard hasn't earned the room yet. I earned mine slow. 1 job site, 1 contract, 1 sleepless night at a time. By the time I was 38, Rivers Development Group had 40 employees and a reputation in this city that meant something. Her mother, Zora, brought banana pudding to our house the first Sunday I met her, and told everyone at the table I was exactly the kind of steady man this family needed. I believed her. That was my mistake. Not marrying Imani, not trusting Zora. My mistake was thinking steady meant safe. 7 years ago, the company nearly went under. A financing deal on the Atlantic Station project fell through 3 weeks before we broke ground. And I had two choices: walk away from 4 years of work, or find money nobody knew I had. My father had left me 40 acres outside of Noonan, Georgia, land that had been in our family since his own father bought it in 1961, back when a black man buying 40 acres in Coweta County was its own kind of quiet defiance. I sold 22 of those acres without telling a soul. I told Imani the capital came from an outside investor. I let her believe it. I didn't want her to see me as a man who needed saving. Not then, not ever. That land is gone now. My father's land. I've never told anyone that until this moment, and I'm only telling you because you need to understand something about me before this story really begins. I have spent most of my adult life protecting people from having to see me struggle. I thought that was strength. I'm still deciding whether it was strength or just a different kind of silence. So there I stood on those courthouse steps in the rain, in a dark gray suit that used to belong to a company I'd poured half my life into, listening to my wife tell a small crowd of reporters and 2 of my own former employees. Effective immediately, Malik Rivers is no longer part of Rivers Development Group. The company needs fresh leadership, aligned with our new vision. She'd replaced me with her cousin, a 28-year-old with sunglasses on indoors and no construction experience beyond an internship he quit after 6 weeks. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at her for very long. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Nia Thompson, my assistant for 11 years. The only person in that company who'd ever seen the real ledgers, the real sacrifices, the real cost of keeping this family's business standing. She picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Rivers?" she said, her voice steady even through the rain crackling faintly against my phone's mic. I kept my eyes on Imani the entire time I spoke. I wanted her to watch me say it, even if she couldn't hear the words. "Fire every one of them," I said. Low, even, final. There was a brief pause on the line, not surprise, just the quiet of a woman who'd been waiting 14 months to hear exactly those 4 words. "Understood," Nia said. "I'm on it." I hung up, slid the phone back into my pocket, and said nothing else. Not to the reporters, not to Imani, not to Zora, standing there with her knuckles white around that umbrella. Now, if you're wondering how a man who was just publicly fired from his own company could turn around and fire the people who fired him, you're asking exactly the right question. Because nothing about that courthouse scene was the ending. It was the very last domino in a plan that had been quietly falling into place for 14 months. That evening, I sat in my truck outside the house in Collier Heights, my mother's house, the one she left me, the one with the wraparound porch my grandfather built board by board. And I watched Kai through the window, doing his homework at the kitchen table, like nothing in the world had changed. I whispered a promise into that quiet cab, more to myself than to him. "I'm going to keep what I built for you." What Imani and her mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already made sure of it. And in the next segment, I'm going to take you back 14 months, to the day I first noticed the numbers didn't add up, and the quiet decision I made that would change everything. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay with me. This story is for you. Let's go back 6 years, before any of this started to unravel, because you need to see how patient this family was, and how patient I had to become to match them. It was a Sunday afternoon in Collier Heights, The kind of Atlanta fall day where the air finally breaks its summer heat and the maple trees along our street start turning the color of a sunset. Zora Steele showed up at our door unannounced, the way she often did, holding a foil-wrapped pan of her cornbread. Still warm, always warm, like she'd timed the drive specifically so it would be. "I made too much again," she said, the same thing she always said, though anyone with sense could see one pan of cornbread doesn't feed 6. She sat at my kitchen table, complimented my coffee, asked about Kai's football season, and then, almost like an afterthought, mentioned that her grandson Tyrese was between opportunities and wondered if there might be a place for him at Rivers Development Group. Nothing big, she said, just somewhere he could learn. I said I'd think about it. I meant it as a polite no. Imani heard the exchange from the hallway and came in smiling, already halfway to yes. "Family looks out for family, Malik," she said, resting a hand on my shoulder like that settled it. "Especially our kind of family. You know how hard it is for young black men to get a real shot in this industry." She wasn't wrong about that last part. That's what made it so hard to say no. Tyrese started in procurement 3 weeks later. I want to be clear about something. I have never had a problem giving people chances. I've hired ex-offenders, high school dropouts, men twice my age starting over after layoffs. What I had a problem with was watching invoices come through procurement that didn't match the vendors we'd used for 15 years. Small at first. A few $1,000s here, routed through a supply company I'd never heard of. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. I was looking. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I've learned that the moment you speak too early, people simply get better at hiding. 14 months before that rainy morning at the courthouse, I sat alone in my office on a Friday night, long after everyone had gone home, going through a stack of quarterly reports with a red pen and a cup of coffee gone cold. The numbers from 3 consulting invoices didn't reconcile against any actual work product. I traced the shell company back through 2 filings to an LLC registered at Zora Steele's home address. I remember exactly what that felt like. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and heavier, like watching a slow leak in a roof you spent years building. I called Naya into my office that night. She'd worked for me since the company had 12 employees and 1 job site trailer. She'd seen me build this thing from nothing. And more than that, she was the only person besides my late mother who ever really understood what it cost me. "I need you to start keeping records," I told her. Quietly. Actual timesheets, actual invoices, everything. Dated, backed up in 2 places. She didn't ask why. She just nodded and said, "How far back do you want me to go?" "As far as it takes." What Naya and I built over the next year wasn't revenge, not at first. It was documentation. A blue notebook kept off the company servers, cross-referencing every inflated invoice against real vendor pricing. Copies of internal emails, some of them recovered after being deleted, showing conversations between Imani and Tyrese about restructuring once the divorce settles. A paper trail 4 inches thick, sitting quietly in a fireproof lockbox in a storage unit off Cheshire Bridge Road that nobody in Imani's family knew existed. There's a particular kind of loneliness in preparing for a war nobody else knows is happening. I want to tell you about one night in that period, because I think about it more than almost anything else from that year. 4 years ago, before any of the invoices, before I'd even noticed anything wrong, the company hit a cash crunch on a project that would have put 50 of our people out of work if it collapsed. I made a decision I never told Imani about. I quietly took out a second mortgage against the Collier Heights house, my mother's house, the only thing of hers I had left. and used it to bridge the gap until the next draw came through. That same week, I married my wife, believing partnership meant something sturdier than what it turned out to be. And that same week, years later, she was in Charlotte at a gala thrown by her mother's business circle, being celebrated as one of Atlanta's black women reshaping the skyline. I sat home with Kai, eating leftover spaghetti, watching the mortgage papers dry on the counter, telling myself I'd tell her eventually. I never found the right moment. Maybe I never looked for one. I think part of me already knew, even then, that the version of our marriage where I was allowed to be tired, allowed to need help, allowed to be anything other than steady, that version didn't exist anymore. So I stopped offering that version of myself up for judgment. I just kept building and kept quiet. 10 months before the courthouse, things accelerated. I found a signed strategic partnership agreement with an outside investment group, a document promising to sell off a controlling share of company stock, using a power of attorney with my signature on it. My signature. One I had never signed. There was something else I found that same week, tucked in a drawer in the home office we used to share. A rubber stamp bearing an exact replica of my signature, the kind used for high-volume paperwork. I hadn't ordered it. I never asked who had. That stamp, I'd later learn, appeared on 3 documents I had never seen, months before I even knew to go looking. I sat with that piece of paper a long time. Forgery isn't a small word. It's not a misunderstanding you talk through over dinner. It's a decision somebody made, deliberately, believing I would never look closely enough to catch it. That night, I drove out to Piedmont Park, parked near the Lake Clara Mere overlook, and sat there until almost 1 in the morning. I thought about my son sleeping at home. I thought about my father's land, half of it already gone. I thought about my mother's house, the one with the porch swing that's creaked the same way since before I was born, and how easily someone could decide to sell it out from under me. I whispered a promise to no one in particular that night, one that had nothing to do with buildings or contracts. Whatever I sacrificed to keep this family standing, I'm not going to let them walk away with it like it was theirs to spend. When I got home that night, I stood over Kai's sneakers by the door, laces still tied the way he always left them, too lazy to undo the knots. I straightened them anyway, a small ritual for a promise I hadn't said out loud yet. That's the night I stopped being a man waiting for things to get better and became a man building a case. Every 90 seconds after that felt like it anyway. Another invoice, another email thread, another quiet confirmation that this had never been about family. It had been about access. And I had given them all of it, freely, because I believed the word family meant something to people who used it as often as Zora Steele did. I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go, and exactly how much I still hadn't discovered. 1 or 2, no in between. Malik stayed silent for 14 months while his own signature was being forged behind his back. Comment 1 if that patience was wisdom. Comment 2 if it was a mistake that let them go too far. Pick one. 2 days after the courthouse, with rain coming down steady over Buckhead, Zora Steele showed up at my front door, carrying a foil pan of cornbread, same as always, and an apology I hadn't asked for. I want to pause here and be straight with you about something important. Imani's announcement on those courthouse steps had been made in front of cameras, but it had never gone through the board. She had the title of CEO, not the unilateral authority to remove a sitting chairman without a vote. I'd spent those first 2 days quietly confirming exactly that with the company's outside counsel. Not reacting, just making sure the ground I was about to stand on was solid. I almost didn't answer the door that Thursday evening. I'm glad I did, Because what happened in the next 20 minutes told me more than 14 months of invoices ever could. She stood on my porch, her umbrella dripping onto the welcome mat. Mascara smudged just slightly at the corners of her eyes. Whether from the rain or something real, I couldn't tell you even now. "Malik, baby, I know things have been hard," she said, the words coming out soft and practiced. "I'm not here to fight. I just need you to reactivate the operating accounts before the end of the month. There's a loan coming due, and it's collateralized against revenue from a few of the consulting entities. If those accounts stay frozen, it's going to be a real problem for everybody." Standing there in the rain, I realized my wife had likely known about this visit before Zora ever knocked. Nothing in that family moved without her signing off on it first. Not anymore, and maybe not ever. The rain tapped steady against the porch roof, a sound I'd always found calming until that night. I watched a bead of water slide off the edge of her umbrella and land on the toe of her shoe. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching taut between us like something about to snap. My jaw tightened, but I kept my hands loose at my sides, a trick I'd learned years ago on job sites when losing your temper cost more than it ever solved. I let her keep talking. That's a skill, letting someone keep talking. People reveal more in the silence they think means you're softening than they ever do when you're pushing them. "Once this settles," she went on, "Imani's going to liquidate some of the company's holdings, and everybody walks away clean. It doesn't have to be ugly, Malik. We're still family." Then she said the sentence that I will remember for the rest of my life, delivered with a little laugh, like she was letting me in on a joke I should have already understood. "You were never the brains of this operation, sweetheart. You were just the muscle. Somebody had to hold the hammer while smarter people held the plans." I understood, standing there, that Zora wasn't really asking me for money. She was asking me to stay small. A woman who raised 2 children alone on a cafeteria worker's salary learns early that control is the only insurance policy nobody can repossess. And somewhere along the way, keeping her daughter's household under her own quiet authority had become the last proof that the widow from 30 years ago never has to be powerless again. Calling me the muscle wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was fear wearing the mask of confidence. The same fear that had been driving every invoice, every forged signature, every warm pan of cornbread pressed into my hands like a peace offering that was never really about peace. I want you to understand something about that moment, because on the surface it might sound like just an insult. It wasn't. It was a confession. She'd just told me, without meaning to, that the family had never seen me as a partner. I was labor. Convenient, reliable, disposable labor. And in that same breath, something else surfaced in me. A memory from 3 years earlier that I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. Imani had come down with a fever of 102 the night before the biggest pitch of her career, a partnership presentation to a group of investors that would define the next 5 years of the company's growth. I stayed up until 4 in the morning finishing her slides, rehearsing her talking points out loud in an empty office so she could sleep. The next morning, I sat in the back of that boardroom in a folding chair while she stood at the podium and took every ounce of credit, glowing under the recessed lighting, thanking her vision and her team without once looking my way. I clapped anyway. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the company survived. I told myself that a lot over the years. Standing on my porch, listening to Zora call me the muscle, I finally understood what all those nights had actually cost me. Not money. Recognition. The basic decency of being seen. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my jacket pocket and turned on a small recorder Naya had given me weeks earlier, tucked flat against my chest. "You call it family," I said quietly, "but you're trying to take my mother's house." Zora's face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "Nobody's taking anything that isn't already halfway gone, Malik. You signed papers. You made choices." "I signed a mortgage to save this company," I said. "I never signed away my mother's house to a stranger's investment fund." She didn't answer that. She just picked her umbrella back up, told me to think it over, and walked back to her car, leaving the cornbread on my porch table, untouched, going cold in the rain. 3 days later, 5 days after the courthouse, I called an emergency meeting of the board. Not to fight, to finish what 14 months of quiet work had prepared me for. The boardroom on the 12th floor of our Buckhead offices has floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Peachtree Street, the kind of view that used to make me proud every time I walked in. That morning the sky was gray and low, rain streaking the glass, and the room felt colder than the thermostat could account for. Imani sat at the head of the table in a cream-colored suit, jaw tight, phone gripped in one hand like it might steady her. Zora sat beside her, that same practiced warmth pulled tight over something else now, something closer to fear. Tyrese lounged 2 seats down, sunglasses pushed up on his head, still wearing the confidence of a man who believed this meeting would go exactly the way the courthouse announcement had. I walked in 5 minutes late. I didn't sit in the chairman's seat. Imani had already given that to Tyrese, though the board had never voted on it. I stood at the back of the room instead, with Nia beside me, holding a thin folder and a flash drive. Imani started the meeting the way she'd clearly rehearsed it. "Today we'll be formalizing the leadership transition and finalizing the removal of legacy roles that no longer align with the company's direction." "Before we vote on anything," I said, my voice even, carrying easily in that quiet room, "I think everyone should see a few documents." Nia plugged in the drive. The screen at the front of the room filled with the first image, real timesheets from our field crews, laid side by side against the official payroll records. Records that had been quietly padded for 2 years through Zora's shell entities. Then came the inflated invoices, dozens of them, routed through the same handful of consulting LLCs, all traceable to addresses connected to the Steele family. Then, deleted emails Nia had recovered, conversations between Imani and Tyrese from 8 months earlier, discussing timelines for phasing Malik out following the divorce filing. And then, the document that made the room go completely silent. A scanned copy of the second mortgage on the Collier Heights house, dated 4 years earlier. My own signature at the bottom, next to a second document. A proposed sale of that same property to an outside buyer. My signature, forged onto a power of attorney I had never authorized. I looked directly at Imani. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That house belonged to my mother. I mortgaged it 4 years ago to save this company, the same week you were in Charlotte at your family's gala. I never told you because I didn't want you to see me as someone who needed help. Now you're trying to sell it without my signature on the actual sale." For the first time since I'd known her, Imani had nothing to say. Then Jamal, our company's accountant, a man Imani had trusted completely, a man I'd quietly asked to help Nia and me 2 years earlier, stood up on his own. "Everything on that screen is accurate," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "I've been documenting the discrepancies since Mr. Rivers first asked me to look into the procurement irregularities. It's all here." Zora's composure cracked in a way I'd never seen. "Malik, we can fix this quietly. We can still—" You had 14 months to fix it quietly, I said. You chose to fire me on courthouse steps in front of cameras instead. Watch what happens next, because this wasn't the moment Malik got angry. This was the moment he finally let the truth speak for itself. Do you think he handled it with too much restraint? Or exactly the right amount of control? The room stayed silent for a long moment after Jamal sat back down. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your chest. Imani tried once more, her voice smaller now, stripped of the boardroom polish she usually wore like armor. Malik, you can't do this to me. We had a family. Whatever went wrong, we had something real once. Looking at her in that moment, I finally understood something about my wife that 14 years of marriage hadn't taught me as clearly as 14 minutes of watching her lose everything did. Imani had never learned how to want to be loved. She had only learned how to want to be undefeated. Somewhere between her mother's lean years and her own rise, being right had quietly replaced being close as the thing that made her feel safe. She wasn't lying when she said we'd had something real. She simply couldn't tell the difference anymore between being married to me and being ahead of everyone else, including me. That confusion, I think, was the real inheritance Zora had passed down. Not a house, not a company, but the belief that love you can't control isn't love you can trust. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me still remembered the woman who'd once fallen asleep against my shoulder on a cross-country flight, who used to leave notes in my lunch bag when we were newlyweds and neither of us had 2 dimes to rub together. That woman was in this room somewhere, buried under 14 years of ambition and other people's whispered permissions. I let myself grieve her, quietly, for exactly 1 breath. Then I answered the woman actually standing in front of me. We did have something real, I said. You're the one who chose to end it by bringing your family in to take what was never theirs. I'm not doing anything to you, Imani. I'm just taking back what belongs to me and our son. The board didn't need long to deliberate. 11 minutes by my watch. 11 minutes to unwind 14 months of quiet infiltration. The vote was nearly unanimous. Tyrese was removed from his position immediately, along with 2 other Steele family hires who'd been placed in finance and procurement over the preceding 2 years. Imani was stripped of her CEO title, effective that afternoon, pending a full internal audit and consultation with the company's outside counsel regarding the forged power of attorney. I was reinstated as chairman, a position I'd never legitimately lost, since the board had never actually voted to remove me. My majority ownership stake, structured years earlier specifically to prevent exactly this kind of takeover, meant the outcome was never really in question once the truth was on the table. Imani and Zora were asked to vacate the building within 24 hours. I want to tell you what that moment actually felt like, because it wasn't what you'd expect. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The specific tiredness that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. I walked to the window and looked out over Peachtree Street, the rain still falling in that same steady rhythm it had been all morning. Behind me, I heard Zora's composure finally break completely. Not into anger, but into something quieter and sadder, a kind of muttering to herself. All of this, over a few contracts. A few contracts. As if the scale of what she'd tried to take could somehow be minimized by saying it small enough. Naya stepped up beside me at the window, careful to keep some distance, the way she always did. Professional, steady, present without ever intruding. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm okay," I said. "Just tired. Tired from a lot of years of staying quiet." She didn't try to fill that silence with something reassuring. She just stood there with me and let it be what it was. I need to pause the story here and tell you about something that happened 3 years before this boardroom, because I think it matters for understanding why that "few contracts" line cut as deep as it did. There was a season back then when the company was scaling fast and I was working 18-hour days just to keep the wheels on. Kai was 9. He had a school play, a small production, something about the water cycle, the kind of thing that feels enormous when you're 9 and forgettable when you're an adult. Except it's never actually forgettable. Not really. I told myself I'd catch the second half after wrapping up a site inspection. The inspection ran long. I got to the school gymnasium just as the lights came up, and parents were filing out, holding bouquets of grocery store flowers for their kids. Kai was standing by the stage in his little cardboard rain cloud costume, scanning the crowd, and I watched his face do the thing kids' faces do when they're trying very hard not to look disappointed in front of their friends. I never told Imani how much that moment cost me. I never told anyone. I just carried it, the way I carried most things, quietly and alone, filed away next to every other Sunday I'd worked instead of resting, every anniversary I'd half remembered because a project deadline had eaten the week. Every ounce of myself I'd poured into building something I believed we were building together. Standing at that boardroom window, watching Zora Steele mutter about "a few contracts," I understood something I hadn't let myself fully see before. None of my sacrifices had ever really been seen. Not by Imani, not by her family. They'd been useful. That's a very different thing from being valued. By early evening, the transition was already moving. Security escorted Tyrese out with a single box of belongings, mostly sneakers he kept under his desk, and a framed photo of himself at a company event he'd attended for 3 weeks total. He didn't say a word on his way out, just adjusted his sunglasses even though the sun had long since gone behind the clouds. Imani stopped at the elevator bank, and for a moment I thought she might turn around. She didn't. The doors closed on her reflection in the polished steel. A woman I had built a life with, standing very small in a very large lobby she used to walk through like she owned every inch of it. Zora lingered longest, gathering a few things from a desk drawer she'd claimed as her own over the past 2 years. Watching her move slower than anyone else toward the door, I thought, unwillingly, of something Imani had told me once. That her mother had been widowed at 31. Raising 2 kids alone on a school cafeteria worker's salary, and had sworn her family would never again depend on anyone else's mercy. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand the hunger behind it, and that understanding made it easier to let her go without hating her for it. That night, I drove home to Collier Heights instead of my downtown apartment. I sat on the porch, the one my grandfather built, the one that still creaks in exactly the same spot it always has. And I let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in 14 months. Relief. Thin and quiet, settling over me like the evening air. Before we close out the climax, do you think Malik should have let Imani say more, given their history? Or was cutting the conversation short exactly what she deserved? I want to hear where you land. The morning after the vote, I sat alone in the chairman's office. My office again. With the city of Atlanta waking up slow through the window. Streetlights still glowing faintly against a lightening sky. On the desk in front of me sat the signed transfer of control. The ink barely dry. The culmination of 14 months I'd carried mostly by myself. Naya knocked once and let herself in, setting down a black coffee and a thin folder without a word. That was one of the things I valued most about her. She never needed the moment explained to her. She just showed up, exactly the way the moment required. "They finished moving out," she said. "Tyrese, the two others. Zora called this morning. She wants to see you. One last time." I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to drink one sip of coffee. "No," I said. "I don't need to see her again. I just need them gone." There was no anger in the words, only clarity. Some doors close not because you're punishing someone on the other side of them, but because you've simply finished with what was behind them. Naya told me later that she'd watched Zora leave the building for the last time that afternoon, from the lobby window while wrapping up final paperwork. Zora walked out carrying that same pan of cornbread, still uneaten, the foil starting to curl at the edges. She stood under the awning a long moment, looking up at the company sign, the one she used to point out to friends at church, telling them proudly, "That's my daughter's company." Then she turned and got into the back of a car her driver had brought around, a modest sedan, nothing like the town cars that used to be arranged for her through Imani's office. Naya said Zora didn't look back once. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that story secondhand. I felt something closer to grief for the version of family I'd once hoped that woman actually believed in. That evening, I drove out to Collier Heights earlier than usual. Kai was sitting on the front steps waiting for me, backpack still on, the porch light not yet turned on behind him. He'd clearly been there a while. I parked, got out, loosened my tie, and sat down beside him on the steps. The same steps I used to sit on as a boy myself, waiting for my own father to come home from job sites. "Bo," he said, the name he'd taken to calling me a few years back, a mashup of bro and dad that started as a joke and stuck. "Is Mom okay?" I thought carefully before I answered. Kai deserved the truth, but he also deserved a truth he could carry at 12 years old. "Your mom's going to be okay," I said. "She's got some things to work through, but she's going to be okay. From here on out, your mom and I are going to live in two different places. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you still have both of us fully in your life." He nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're absorbing something bigger than they can fully name yet. I put my arm around his shoulders and looked up at the house behind us, the one my mother left me, the one my grandfather built board by board, the one that had nearly slipped through my fingers because I'd trusted the wrong people with the truth about how hard I'd fought to keep it. As we sat there, the porch swing creaking its same old rhythm behind us, I thought of my own father teaching me to swing a hammer on this same patch of grass. His hand wrapped over mine, correcting my grip without a word of frustration. "Slow is smooth," he used to say, "and smooth is what lasts." I hadn't thought of that phrase in years. Sitting there with Kai's shoulder warm against my side, I understood, maybe for the first time, that I'd been living by it the whole 14 months without realizing it. "I kept my promise to my mother," I said, mostly to myself. "And to you." In the days that followed, I focused on something other than the wreckage of what had happened. I focused on repair. I signed the formal, legal terminations for every member of the Steele family who'd been placed inside the company. Documented, clean, defensible in any court in Georgia. But I also went the other direction. I found Mary, a woman who'd worked in our accounting department for 11 years, quietly overlooked for promotions, her hours cut whenever budget adjustments needed to happen under Imani's leadership. I moved her into a senior role she'd earned 3 times over. I found 2 field supervisors who'd been underpaid relative to their tenure for years and corrected their compensation retroactively. There was no press conference, No public statement calling anyone out by name. I had Nia draft a short, professional release for local business outlets. Rivers Development Group reaffirms its commitment to transparency and fair leadership following an internal governance review. That was all it needed to say. The people who mattered already knew the truth. The people who didn't need a spectacle. I think that's a lesson I had to learn slowly, over many years of being underestimated. Real justice rarely looks like the movies. It doesn't come with a courtroom gasp or a dramatic reveal set to swelling music. Sometimes, it just looks like paperwork done correctly, and people who lied finally having to live with what the truth costs. That first week, I slept better than I had in over a year. Not because everything was resolved. Divorce proceedings still had months left to run, and there would be legal follow-up on the forged documents for a while yet. I slept better because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying a secret. Everyone who needed to know now knew. Have you ever had to quietly rebuild something after someone you trusted tried to take it from you? I'd love to hear how you found your footing again. Tell me in the comments. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in Piedmont Park, I laid out an old checkered blanket under a stand of oak trees near the lake. The kind of late spring Atlanta afternoon where the air smells like cut grass and somebody's charcoal grill 3 picnic tables over. Kai ran off almost immediately to play fetch with a neighbor's dog, laughing in that unrestrained way that only kids and people who've truly relaxed can laugh. Nia sat across from me on the blanket, unpacking a container of salad and a jar of the lemonade she made from scratch, the way she'd been doing at company gatherings for years, without anyone quite noticing how much thought she put into small things. I watched my son chase that dog across the grass for a while, before I said what I'd been meaning to say for weeks. Thank you, I told her. Not just for the last 14 months, for being here today. She smiled, that same steady smile she'd worn through boardrooms and blue notebooks and late nights that neither of us ever talked about outside of work. You don't need to thank me, she said. I just did what a loyal assistant should do. And, I hope, what a friend does. I let that sit in the air between us, warm and uncomplicated, without needing to turn it into more than it was that day. Some things don't need to be rushed. I'd learned that the hard way. A little later, Kai flopped down on the blanket beside me, out of breath, grass stains already working their way into his knees. "Bo," he said, "how come you're not mad at Mom? How come you never talk bad about her to me?" I've thought about how to answer that question for a long time, long before he ever asked it honestly. I took a moment before I spoke, wanting to get it right. Because being angry doesn't build anything, son, I said. I was angry for a while. I was hurt for longer than I probably let myself admit. But if I spent all my energy hating your mom, I wouldn't have had anything left over to love you, or to rebuild the company, or to keep the promise I made about this land. So I chose something different. I chose to protect what mattered by staying quiet, gathering what was true, and acting only when it actually counted. He nodded slowly, the way he does when something is settling into him for keeps. That sounded like it was hard, he said. It was, I told him. It still is some days, but it's a lot easier than carrying hate around for the rest of your life. That evening, after Nia and Kai had both headed home, I stood alone on the porch of the Collier Heights house as the sun dropped low over the Atlanta skyline, gold light settling across the yard the same way it had settled there my whole childhood. I thought about how many nights I'd stood on porches like this one, waiting for financing to clear, waiting for a phone call, waiting for someone to finally see what I'd carried. This time, standing there, I wasn't waiting for anything. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was simply present. And that, it turned out, was its own kind of arrival. This story reminds us that legacy was never about the size of the company or the number on a settlement. It's the version of yourself you can still recognize once everyone who claimed to love you has finished telling you who to be instead. If someone in your own family ever uses the word family to ask for something that costs you more than it costs them, don't answer that same day. Write it on an index card, set it beside the sugar bowl on the counter, and sleep on it. Read it back once, out loud, before your coffee the next morning. If it still sounds like love in daylight, say yes. If it sounds like a bill wearing love's clothing, say no. Kindly, plainly, and only once. That's not coldness. That's the same quiet arithmetic that kept Malik's son's inheritance safe, board vote by board vote, invoice by invoice, silence by silence. Every line in these emotional stories comes from real human insight and lived experience. AI was used only to enhance clarity and pacing, allowing deep lessons about kindness, systemic bias, and personal strength to resonate with a global audience. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.